in defining the foundational stage, you often mention the approach which was typical of the classical economists, that of investigating the primary and natural features of an economic system. So which are the how would you define the primary and natural features of an economic system? This is what I think sometimes is not totally clear to people who are not familiar with your work. So what do you mean by primary and natural features of an economic system?
What did Ricardo mean when he used that? Perhaps he didn't know himself how to define them. Are those relations that appear to be logically making consistent the whole framework. I think I can't go beyond that.
Which was Adam Smith's early intuition about this?
Yes, the Adam Smith early intuition was that as it is presented in the first page, really, of the first chapter of his Wealth of Nations, is that the basic explanation of any value is connected with the toil and trouble with which you can produce that particular commodity. So that if in order to catch a beaver, wasn't it the beaver, it takes twice the amount of labor you need in order to catch what? A rabbit. As normally in the long run, the two fruits of your labor will exchange in 1 to 2. That was.
So labor embodied is the same as labor commanded.
The labor embodied in the commodity explains the rate of exchange. And this, in a pure labor economy, also carries with it not only the amount of labor embodied, but the amount of labor that each commodity can command on the exchange that is taking place. So there is this identity between labor embodied and labor commanded that in a primitive economy explains any exchange. That was his idea. But of course he was adding, when the system becomes more complicated, and in order to produce anything, you need not only labor, but also land and stocks, capital. The final elements that are composing the rate of exchange will also include, besides labor, also a profit on the stock and a rent for the owners of land. Now this, however, this way of presenting the rate of exchange, of the natural way in which one can see the rate of exchange of the various commodities, had, and he was quite aware of this, have the disadvantage of making a difference between the primitive economy and an advanced economy. In the primitive economies, the elements are very clear. It's labor embodied and labor commanded, and the two elements are coincided. In a more advanced society, you have a kind of addition principle to apply, which include labor, profits, and rent, and this comes to complicate the relation between embodied and commanded labor. Labor embodied does not coincide with labor commanded, which is a complication that, however, he, in his basic proposition, also left aside. He always talked of labor embodied when he was dealing with the basic proposition, leaving aside the complications of an advanced society. And this, the interesting aspect is that any time he came later on, after this early proposition, to deal with the what we might call the macroeconomic relation in the economy, he always left aside the complicated case and always referred his analysis basically to what appears here as the more primitive version of the problem, you see. So that Adam Smith's theory of value always remained, in a sense, in a kind of incomplete way, because all the basic propositions were carried on in terms of a primitive society, while what he was then applying his relation to were referring to an advanced society. And after Smith disappeared the basic complication of theory, and we can see immediately what Ricardo tried to do. He began by picking up Smith's proposition, but immediately trying to eliminate rent. And he succeeded in doing this by going straight to the what later economists called the marginal rent. By going at that point, the addition, the additive principle that Smith had in mind had already become limited to wages and profit, having taken rent out of the basic analytical elaboration. And that was no doubt Ricardo's great contribution to deal then with profits. He proceeded to elaborate a model, we might say, in which the proportions of capital and labor were the same for all the economy.
So you mean the organic composition of capital?
Well, that is how Marx
called it, but
that's how Marx solved the problem. But he simply thought that by going to the marginal rent, or rather to going to the marginal piece of land, he could elaborate his theory with reference to the marginal piece of land which had no rent.
Exactly.
In that way, he could eliminate rent and remain with profit and wages. Now, about profit and wages, of course, he was in trouble in a sense, but he used at various points the argument that, after all, the fact that the proportion of capital and labor, although were different from various commodities, they gave rise to a small amount or small variations, so that on the whole he could take it for granted that all the commodities, rent excluded, would obey, in a sense, approximately to the principle which Smith had in mind, namely the principle that all rates of exchange would coincide with labor embodied. Although then there was a problem with the labor commanded. Actually, it's very interesting to see that later on in Sraffa's elaborations, the connection between labor embodied and labor commanded is elaborated further with respect to the standard system. That's a very interesting aspect of Sraffa. But that was the point at which Ricardo had arrived. Now, Marx picked up Ricardo and went one step further, in a sense, in his elaborations, as he began to introduce the concept of organic composition of capital. In Marx's analysis, and it is the analysis that Marx carried out with reference to the help, in a sense, that analytically he got from the concept of
organic composition of capital.
Organic composition of capital, and it's something which he carried out late in his analysis, in volume 3 of his volume Capital, while in the other, earlier, he used a very simple assumption, namely the assumption that the organic composition of capital was the same for all commodities. It was another way of solving Smith's problem. You see, Smith's analysis was actually putting all the elaboration that came out of later on in trouble, because they couldn't solve this
puzzle.
This puzzle. Ricardo adopted the assumption that these differences were minor, but approximately he could forget about them, and Marx adopted the attitude of thinking of the organic composition of capital as being uniform all over the system. Now, in this way, whether you considered it as approximately small, or you considered it as referring to an organic composition of capital which is the same for all commodities, allowed them to proceed, in fact, with the assumption that by and large the rates of exchange were proportional to labor embodied, really, although there was then a difference with labor commanded, you see. And that is where the problem rested, in a sense, at least with Ricardo. Now, what is the next step? The next step is...
you mentioned when you gave me this, when you were talking to me about that, you said an additional thing, that is that Marx, you used the expression, he decided to cut the Gordian knot. I mean, he said, okay, the difference between labor embodied and labor commanded is actually...
the exploitation.
The exploitation. So that was a way also in which he was thinking of the issue. I think that the next one could be somehow Sraffa with his way of solving at least Ricardo's problem of looking for an invariant standard of value. Or maybe we can go straight to Pasinetti's way of solving the problem.
No, Pasinetti's way comes later. There is an intermediate step which I relied on. I can't remember now. You see, didn't think we would get into these problems today, so I didn't look it up. But there is an intermediate step. Now, the intermediate step is relating to the assumption or the further step-by-step approach in which we are in a perfectly stationary system. If we are in a perfectly stationary system, then it is enough to envisage a situation in which you rely on rates of exchange which are proportional not only to the direct amount of labor, but also to the addition of the labor which is direct with the labor which is indirect, was called indirect, which is the labor that goes into the means of production.
The replacement of
capital. Now, if we are in that stage, we have a system of prices and actually a system of values. This is how a system of values which refers to the amount of labor embodied.
So this means that basically we are extending the concept of labor embodied to include not only direct labor, but also indirect labor.
But indirect labor.
This extension
and
of the
this was the contribution of Marx first, and it was the contribution of all those who took Marx as their starting point. It also is the stage at which it becomes it becomes reasonable to consider any surplus on that as exploitation, because if we consider the embodied labor in the economic system, and we are in a stationary situation, the embodied labor is obtained by the addition of direct labor and indirect labor, and that is what I in my expounding the Marx system, I called the ideal, the ideal prices, which are values in terms of Marx without surplus.
And so I think you also mentioned all the trend of economic thought, which also political thought, which went under the capita of Ricardian socialists.
Yes, that's right. You see, the Ricardian, there was a group of people among the followers of Ricardo that always considered any addition to embodied labor itself considered as an addition of direct and indirect labor as the ideal price system. In an ideal price system of this type, again, embodied labor come to coincide with commanded labor, but labor must be considered as the sums of direct and indirect. Now, in such an economic system, perfectly stationary, you can apply on one side Ricardian theory of rent by going to the marginal to the
less productive piece of land.
You see, one could use the term marginal if one stayed, if we didn't have the following exploitation of this concept by the marginalists. You see, and but it means simply marginal land is the marginal piece of land, the less productive land. Now, within the concept, within the framework of the Ricardian socialists, the system again is very simple and clear, because it is composed of direct labor and indirect labor. The summation of these two additions brings out the production prices, which come to coincide with commanded labor, which come to coincide with Marxian values. You see. One achieves, in a sense, a complete homogeneity and a complete generalization of the original Smithian framework in terms of pure labor, which includes direct and indirect labor, which itself comes to coincide with commanded labor, and which coincide with Marxian values. And you have again completed a complete system, but of course it is very particular, because it's not the one that you can observe in a capitalist economy. And at this point, it's enough that you introduce Marxian concept of exploitation or surplus value that you introduce, which comes to be added and to determine, in a sense, a system which is characteristic in Marxist terminology of the capitalist system, in which there is exploitation and surplus values. And there is a gap between the prices of production and the values, the values of in Marxian sense. And here appears a solution that, of course, refers to the capitalist economy, but in a very how do you say, unsatisfactory way, because you and at this point the problem arises of the transformation of values into prices, values being the ideal rates of exchange, prices being the rates of exchange that are characteristic of a particular institutional setup, which is the capitalist system, which has the surplus value as an indication of exploitation. You see.
So then the problems really emerge when when growth is introduced into the picture.
That's right. When growth is introducing, of course, if we introduce growth, we still get back to the problem of diversion between values and prices in Marxian terminology, between commanded and embodied labor in any type of say analytical formulation of the problem.
But it's here that you provided a solution.
It's here that it is here that I began to look at a stage, a step of the analysis which may be set as coming after the previous formulation. The concept really is due to Sraffa, although he himself did not realize, most probably, the enormous importance and fecundity, I mean, of this concept. Actually, he thought of it in terms of subsystems. And you see, the subsystems in Sraffa's book take up an appendix. He's not even inserted into his major work, or at what he thought was his major contribution. It's some kind of appendix which allows him to do an extremely fruitful subdivision of the system, which is putting into relation the final stage, which produce commodities for consumption, with the initial stage, which we can see it better in Lyotard's term, is referred to labor, to the input of labor. There are input of labor on one side, and there are final commodities on the other. It's interesting to look at it as input of labor, pure labor on one side, which is the beginning, and consumption goods in the others. Now the structure of the inputs of labor and the structure of the consumption goods are different, because labor is proportional to technological necessity of production, while consumption is proportional to the choice of consumption, which is decided by the final consumers. And the two vectors in our terms which define this composition are different.
So the rates of change of the two.
And the rates of change of the two are
Since you were
different.
mentioning before the rates of change, which are really important when dealing with
it is
growth.
the rates of change that becomes important at this stage. And how are you going to relate the structure of the rates of change to the structure of the inputs of labor? You see, you relate them. You can relate them by in ideas that originally is put forward by Sraffa, the subsystem, but in elaboration which is due to LLP, so, which is the different rates of change of consumption goods, and the relation between, you see, they are, in order to relate one to the other, you need the whole economic system.
Yeah.
It's the whole economic system that relates the final, the consumption good to the input of labor. But in an expanding economy, in a growing economy, you see, the structure of one of these, the structure of the final vector of the consumption is different from the structure of the inputs of labor. And the two are going to go on increasing at different rates of change.
But I think that there is a major, Sraffa's subsystems, in the traditional definition of Sraffa's subsystems, he says, okay, we have as many subsystems as there are items in the net product. And traditionally, the net product is intended as consumption plus new investments.
Well, but Sraffa doesn't have the investment.
No, of course, because it's stationary. But I think that your main contribution was exactly that of making it explicit that actually new investments are part of the means of production, not of the net product.
That's right.
And so consumption goods only enter into the net product, which is how you could extend the notion of subsystem to transform it into a growing subsystem, and at the same time make the final step towards the complete generalization of the labor theory of value.
Exactly. Nadia has set.
I studied.
In the exposition we are making, this is the point to underline. The underline is that you see, Sraffa didn't use matrix algebra. He didn't. When I first talked to him in terms of matrix algebra, was when I needed to, this is has nothing to do with the problem we are dealing here, but you see, the first time I talked to Sraffa about in matrix notation was when I was trying to find out why Levari was wrong in claiming what was a Samuelson conjecture about the non-switching theorem. You see, that was the first time in which I talked of matrix algebra to Sraffa, and he really and he pushed it aside completely. He didn't want to go into it.
He didn't want to know anything about
Absolutely. We must put this in terms of reasonable algebra.
It seems that here somehow
we meant the one that he learned at the high school. You see.
So somehow Modigliani what Modigliani taught you in terms of trying to formalize was helpful in this case.
Was useful. Was useful on that occasion. But you see, he couldn't get into this. You see, he couldn't get by putting it in terms of matrix algebra. It turned out so easy to see that you could actually split up the whole economic system into subsystems. That's how he did it. I mean, in terms of subsystems which were putting into relation one final good. In his term, it was one item of the net product with not one, but the whole inputs of labor, all the labor inputs on the other side. And that, to me, became very clear. I mean, each one of the final goods were then increasing at a particular rate of change. And it was a rate of change not originating from the labor input, but originating from the decision of the consumers. And looking at the necessity, the technological necessity of growth in an economic system which is growing, and it is growing a la Herod, with two rates of exchange introduced into the analytical framework, the rates of change, percentage rate of change in terms of population increase and the productivity increase.
But now I would like you to complete with the last step the issue of labor theory of value.
Yes,
so we're talking about direct and indirect labor.
That's right.
But then when growth and new investment...
I needed at the end not, in the end, I needed not the consumption outlet, but one step further. The consumption plus the increase in the increased system, subsystem, producing the addition to the consumption.
So what you mean is that when demand grows through time or changes through time, productive capacity has to be expanded or shrink.
That's right, but it expands by its own way, in its own way. At the same time keeping the full employment of capacity, really. Here is not the full employment of labor comes in at the end as a consequence, but there is the idea of productive capacity that comes in, which is the one I contributed, you see. Is the one that this morning when we were talking about the different quantitative notion of capital, you see, I had to add, in addition to the physical quantity in normal physical units. You see, it's there that this concept of productive capacity becomes relevant. You see. It's one way of measuring capital. You see, it's not in Sraffa.
No,
it's not yet, but it had to be added. But at the same time, you see, it was added in terms of the whole system, not in terms of any particular commodity. You see, in Sraffa subsystem there are input of labor on the one side and the outcome of commodities on the others. Now, in the very moment we need further addition, we have to introduce the concept of productive capacity, which comes to complete the subsystem that becomes a growing subsystem.
And the labor which is necessary to produce such additional productive capacity is?
That's right. There is a production that meets the final, which is different, which must be related to all the labor inputs. So you have one single unit or one single final commodity which is consumed at one end, and the whole system,
of course,
the whole growing subsystem in terms of productive capacity on the other.
So let's say that each subsystem is made up by commodities produced by all industries in the economic system. So
the whole industries, and actually the whole industry expanding at the rate of change of the commodity.
So, just to close with the issue of pure labor, because then I would like to go a little bit deeper on this issue of productive capacity, basic commodity, non-basic. But just to close down with this, the quantity of labor which is in each subsystem necessary to produce additional productive capacity is what you call the hyper-integrated or hyper-indirect labor.
Labor, exactly.
And this third component is exactly what allowed you to...
That's right. We have, you see, we had at the beginning Smithian direct labor with all the complications that he had, that he always brushed aside. I think intuitively, you see, he had the intuition.
But he couldn't show that it was correct.
That's right. He couldn't show that it was right. He had the intuition that it was the direct labor. It was the labor, the quantity of labor that was relevant. All the rest were complications. He always left aside when he drew the overall relations. But when he was going back to the single production units, then he had to introduce two complications. One was rent and the other was capital. You see,
so
Ricardo eliminated rent.
And Marx?
And Marx introduced a further step in which he could, well, we had two solutions. One was that of the Ricardian socialists, which was really adding up indirect labor. And the other was Marx's solution, which was taking the indirect labor capital accumulation as an addition and considering all what added and owned by a particular class that was exploiting as the surplus.
Okay, so direct labor with Smith, direct plus indirect labor with, let's say, Marx's Raffian approach, but then with growth into the picture, these two components are not enough, and we still have something which makes commanded and embodied labor to diverge. But with hyper-indirect labor, that is the labor necessary for...
With the addition of a third, there is the addition of a third addendum, which is hyper-indirect labor, which is the labor which is necessary in order to expand the subsystem to match the growth,
sector-specific,
the growth of demand at the end, and by making the addition include direct, indirect, and hyper-indirect labor, we again achieve a quantity of labor which is matching the quantity of labor that is commanded in the end in each growing subsystem. So that, in a sense, if we look at this concept, in a sense, which comes from an addition of three elements, as an expansion and as an extension of the amount of labor that was conceived of intuitively by Adam Smith, we reach again the equality between embodied labor in the complete sense of addition of direct plus indirect plus hyper-indirect labor and the amount of labor commanded, which is embodied in that unit of commodity, which is at the end of the growing subsystem.
So you would agree with me if I were to conclude that your contribution in the field of theory of value is having generalized Smith's intuition that actually values are given by labor, and that this generalization would not have been possible without the concept of vertical integration. So applying the concept of vertical integration is what actually allowed you to reach this complete generalization.
The complete vertical integration leads us to the complete generalization. Yes, that's
so vertical hyperintegration really leads you to generalize.
That is the basic concept, which you see, it was intuited since the beginning. Actually, we may say that at each stage there are further and further intuition, but there was not the realization of what was happening because the analytical tools were not available. One had to have the analytical tool. Well, I mean, the analytical tool is something one uses. What moves the analytical tool is the idea of the extension of the original conception. And the original conception was a quantity of labor, which in the end ended up. And Smith had this idea that at the two ends you have labor on one side and consumption on the other. The purpose of production is consumption in the end. That intuition was already in Adam Smith, but he couldn't express it in analytical way.
So
one needed all the intermediate stages, which I tried to expound, in a sense, in this conversation we have.